The room is quiet, but not with peace. It's the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. In the corner sits a figure, shoulders hunched, eyes darting, lips moving in whispers only they can hear. At first it sounds like mumbling, but then the words sharpen, arguments with voices that aren't there, desperate attempts to reason with ghosts no one else can see. Their hands tremble as if they're holding onto something invisible, something slipping away. From the outside, it looks like madness. But this unraveling didn't begin tonight. It didn't start with the whispers or the sleepless nights. It began years earlier, in moments so small no one noticed. A slammed door, a parent who never asked, a childhood that taught silence louder than words. They weren't always like this. Once they were a child with wonder in their eyes, a child who dreamed in colors, who asked endless questions about the world, but the world didn't answer back. Or worse, it answered with cruelty, with indifference, with absence. And piece by piece, that child learned a terrible lesson. Hope is dangerous, because madness rarely arrives in a flash. It grows in silence. It feeds on neglect, on unspoken grief, on the weight of secrets too heavy for a child to carry. It hides in the sleepless nights, where something feels wrong, even when nothing looks wrong. It waits in the background, building, festering, until one day the mind fractures under the burden of holding it all in. People like to say someone snapped, that it happens suddenly without warning, but the truth is more haunting. No one snaps in an instant. They crack quietly, like glass under pressure, until the fractures spread too far to hide. And here in this dimly lit room, we aren't just watching someone lose control, we're watching the slow burn of years of silence, finally catching fire. This is the story of how a person doesn't just lose their mind, they lose themselves. Before the whispers, before the breakdowns, there was a boy sitting in his childhood bedroom, memorizing the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway. Each creak of the floorboards was a warning sign. Each slammed door was a storm arriving. He learned to read the air the way some children read storybooks, studying faces for the slightest twitch of anger, holding his breath when silence grew too long. The house was never safe, not because of monsters in the dark, but because of the people who were supposed to be protectors. His father came home loud, unpredictable, carrying rage, like a second skin. His mother disappeared into silence, retreating behind closed doors. At the dinner table, words were knives, flung across the plates. No one ever said sorry. No one ever said safe. And so he learned the art of invisibility. He tiptoed, spoke softly, became the background character in his own story. Because in that house, the smallest mistake could become a battlefield. To survive, he had to shrink. Psychologists call this attachment wounding. A child's nervous system is built on the expectation of care, of comfort. But when those needs are denied, the system rewires itself. Love becomes unpredictable, safety becomes conditional, and the very sense of self fractures. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, warned that when bonds are broken in childhood, the scars shape every relationship that follows. But what cut the deepest wasn't the rage, or even the absence, it was the denial. The way everyone pretended nothing was wrong, forced smiles in public. We're fine when everything inside was breaking. That's the poison of silence. It gaslights reality itself. A child begins to doubt their own perception. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the problem. And so he carried that confusion like a second heartbeat. He learned to perform normal, to laugh when nothing was funny, to act strong when inside he was unraveling. Outwardly he was just another kid. Inwardly, he was collecting fractures. Because here's the truth, he didn't break in an instant. He cracked slowly, piece by piece. By the time he reached adolescence, he had become a master of disguise. At school, he was charming, quick with jokes, able to slip into any group and make people laugh. Teachers praised his wit. Friends called him magnetic. He learned how to read people instantly, what they wanted, what they needed, what version of himself would make them stay. But behind that smile was exhaustion. Each interaction felt like a performance, a carefully rehearsed act designed to keep others from seeing what lived beneath the surface. At night, when the crowd was gone and the mask came off, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Insomnia clawed at him. His thoughts looped endlessly. Something is wrong. Something is always wrong. This is what psychologist Donald Winnicott described as the false self, a persona constructed for survival. It is polished, adaptable, endlessly pleasing, but it is not real. The true self, the one that once dreamed in colors and asked endless questions, had been buried under years of silence, and the longer he wore the mask, the harder it became to remember who he actually was. In his early 20s, the cracks deepened. He started carrying notebooks everywhere, scribbling down fragments of thoughts that never made sense when read back. Pages filled with half-sentences, arrows, strange patterns, repeated lines scrawled in desperation. Sometimes a single phrase over and over, "I don't feel real." Mirrors became his enemy. He would stand in front of one, staring into the eyes of the man looking back, and feel nothing. No recognition, no connection, just an empty shell, wearing his face. Paranoia crept in next. He began to believe people were whispering about him, that there were hidden messages in the way strangers looked his way, in the flicker of lights, in the static of a radio. His mind, starved of order and starved of truth, began inventing patterns to fill the silence of his past. And yet, to everyone else, he seemed fine. Better than fine. He was witty, entertaining, the kind of person who lit up a room. No one suspected that beneath the laughter was a hollow echo, that beneath the charm was a man unraveling. Because society rewards the mask, we applaud the ones who can keep smiling, who never ask for too much, who seem to have it all together. But masks can only hold so much weight. And his was beginning to fracture. From the outside he seemed fine, but inside the mask was collapsing. The descent didn't arrive as a single collapse. It came in whispers, at first faint, like thoughts muttered under his breath, then louder, sharper, until it felt like arguments with invisible adversaries echoing inside his skull. He began to hear voices, not random, but insistent. Sometimes they accused, sometimes they mocked, sometimes they warned. To him they felt real. Patterns became his obsession. Streetlights flickering in sequence felt like codes meant only for him. Radio ads held secret messages. A stranger's glance on the subway was no longer just a glance. It was a sign, a warning, a piece of some vast puzzle only he could solve. What others dismissed as coincidence became for him the architecture of fate. His mind, desperate for meaning, was building a new reality out of fragments. This is the hidden cruelty of unresolved trauma. When a child grows up in danger, the nervous system learns hypervigilance, always scanning, always alert, always braced for something to go wrong. In childhood, it keeps you alive, but in adulthood, when there is no clear danger, that same vigilance mutates. The mind, conditioned to search, starts finding threats and meanings where none exist. Psychologists call it trauma splitting, when the psyche, unable to hold unbearable pain, fractures into pieces. One part functions in daily life, another part carries the grief, the rage, the terror that could not be felt at the time. And when those parts are ignored long enough, they begin to bleed through. The voices weren't madness, they were fragments of his own neglected self, screaming for recognition. And yet the world never saw that. They only saw a man unraveling, a mind losing its grip. They didn't see the years of silence that built the collapse. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the notebooks filled with pleas, the mirror where he no longer recognized himself. He wasn't weak. He wasn't cursed. He was exhausted. Decades of carrying pain without language, of burying wounds no one acknowledged, had finally drained him of the strength to keep pretending. What people call going crazy is often nothing more than a soul that has carried too much for too long. From the outside, his unraveling looked like chaos, but from the inside, it was something else entirely. It was the body and mind refusing to stay silent any longer. Madness isn't chaos, it's the soul's protest. Somewhere in the midst of the unraveling, a shift occurred. It didn't come from a miracle, or from someone swooping in to save him. It came from the cracks themselves. The breakdown forced him to face what he had buried for so long. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the collection of pain, rage, grief, and fear we shove into the dark corners of our psyche. The shadow isn't evil. It isn't unnatural. It is simply the parts of ourselves we were never allowed to express. And for him, the shadow was loud. In therapy, he spoke haltingly about the voices, about the notebooks, about the sense of unreality that followed him like a ghost. For the first time, instead of being dismissed or shamed, he was told, "These are parts of you that were silenced. They're not here to destroy you, they're here to be heard." Slowly, he began to see his madness differently. The voices that terrified him were echoes of his childhood self. The patterns he thought were cosmic codes were actually his nervous system's desperate attempt to impose meaning on chaos. What felt like insanity was, in truth, the shadow self finally breaking through. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by pretending the darkness doesn't exist, but by turning toward it. Healing begins the moment the unconscious is made conscious. It wasn't easy. Sitting with his shadow felt like drowning. Old memories rose up, uninvited. Rage he had swallowed as a boy surged back. Tears he had never cried finally broke free. But in those moments of pain, he caught glimpses of something else. Clarity, a fragile kind of truth. Because once the mask cracked, there was no going back. And when he finally looked into the mirror again, the reflection was no longer empty. The mask was gone, and what stared back was the child who had been waiting all along. Healing did not arrive in a straight line. It came in fragments, in moments of release that felt small, but sacred. He began to write again, not the chaotic scribbles of paranoia, but intentional words. Journaling became a way to empty the noise, to give the pain a language, instead of letting it devour him in silence. Some pages were messy, others were just raw sentences. I didn't deserve this. I wanted love. I was a child. But each line was a thread, slowly stitching together pieces of a self he thought was gone. Therapy shifted too. In the beginning, he performed for his therapist, sounding smart, spiritual, even funny. But eventually the performance exhausted him. He stopped trying to impress. He began to cry instead, to speak of nights when he felt like a ghost, to admit the loneliness that had followed him since childhood. That honesty, terrifying as it was, became the first real anchor. And then came grief. Not the clean grief of funerals, but the messy grief of a childhood that never was. He allowed himself to feel anger at the neglect, sadness at the years lost, vulnerability in simply saying, "I needed more than I got." Grieving didn't break him, it freed him from the silence that had always been the true prison. He wasn't cured, he still carried scars, still wrestled with shadows, but he was no longer lost inside them. For the first time he could stand in front of a mirror and recognize the man staring back. Not perfect, not healed, but real, because madness was never the enemy. Silence was. If you've ever felt like you're going crazy, remember this. You're not broken, you're buried. What feels like madness is often the weight of silence, the echo of needs that were never met. Your story isn't proof of weakness, it's proof of survival. If these words touched something in you, share your story in the comments. You never know who else is scrolling right now, desperate to see themselves in someone else's truth. And if you want more stories that peel back the layers of trauma and psychology, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because the brutal past doesn't define you, facing it does.